right, everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get started. All right. So last week we had a great lesson from Greg talking about what did we talk about, right? Long-term health and nutrition, why it's important, why it's so effective, not only what we do here in the gym, but just outside of the gym, right, as well, right? So today we're going to be talking about calories, macros, and body composition. I know it was advertised that I would be taking my shirt off. That will not be happening, so I'm going to turn around. If anyone wants to leave, you can leave. You can go. You've been kicked out of the seminar. But yeah, so we'll talk about calories, macros, and body composition. For those of you who might have explored some of this before, this might be a little bit of a refresher. You know, a lot of it is very base level that we'll talk about, but if we want to dive in any deeper in certain areas, or if you have any questions about little things in these slides, just go ahead and raise your hand. I want to make this as inclusive and as much of a roundtable as it is just me talking. So, but we'll keep everyone else keep your shirts on. So the goal by the end of this session, right, is to understand a little bit more about energy intake and expenditure when it comes to calories that we're consuming and how that affects the calories we are burning throughout the day. Then we're also going to make sure we talk about and know the roles and importance of those macronutrients, dietary protein, carbs, fats, and fiber as well. Then we want you to have a takeaway of what a sustainable approach to nutrition looks like, and then also how we're going to measure our progress, how we're going to, come and check our progress to see if we are actually on the right path. But also we'll talk more about some ways we should not track progress. But we'll get a little bit deeper in that as we move along. So we'll start with daily calories burned. So this is sort of the breakdown of how we burn calories throughout the day. So 70% of those calories are going to come from our BMR, which is our basal metabolic rate. Does anybody know what basal metabolic rate is? Yeah, Helen?
Isn't the calories in burn by like 18?
Exactly. So if we were to sit in bed all day and binge watch Lion King on Netflix, that's what we would need to survive. We'd burn 70% of those calories just existing and going through, our body going through those natural functions that we would, right? So that's a large percentage, and we'll circle back to that a little bit more later on. Next is non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or NEAT for short, and that is basically any sort of non-exercise activity, whether it's our job, we're running around as a school teacher, or we're on our feet all day as a construction worker, anything like that that's non-exercise activity, that contributes to burning a lot of our calories as well, about 15% of those calories as well. So, some days it might be higher, some days it might be lower, just depending on, what we're doing in that particular day. And then 10% of that actually comes from thermic effective feeding, or TEF. So what that is when we consume calories and nutrients in food in general, it takes some calories to actually digest that and to help our body absorb it, right? So we're not just taking those calories and then just having them sit there, right? Some of that, and about 10% of that, actually goes towards helping us digest and absorb those nutrients from that eating, as well as the actual process of eating itself. And then lastly, that 5% comes from exercise specifically in that thermogenesis, right? So we have that non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Now we have the exercise activity thermogenesis. So anything we do in here, anything where we are intentionally exercising, moving our body with the intent of breaking down muscle, building it back up, that is going to contribute to about 5% of our total daily expenditure in terms of calories, okay? Do those make sense in terms of those percentage breakdowns? Does anybody have any questions on those? No? All right, so yeah, it is kind of a big sort of realization that 70% of that just comes from existing, right? We might not think about that, but again, that is a large portion of those calories we're taking in and those calories we're burning throughout the day just for being who we are on a daily basis. Then we go into we'll talk about the macronutrients, right? So there's three big macronutrients that that everyone should know about, and those are protein, carbs, and fats. And while some of them you might be a little bit more skittish to eat, or you might avoid some more than others, all of them are super important, and all of them have a very important function in our body. Protein, for example, when we think about protein, we might think about, you know, big bulky bodybuilders who eat just copious amounts of protein throughout the day. And that is because protein is super important and essential for growth and recovery of our muscles, right? We'll go in a little bit deeper, but if we're coming in the gym, we're beating ourselves down, but we're not eating enough protein, a lot of that muscle and a lot of those gains that we would want are actually lost. So it's super important for that. Also, for satiety, right? So protein, if we eat large portions of it or eat enough of it, help us stay full longer. There's a whole industry around protein bars and there's a reason for that, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about protein specifically. And then carbs. Carbs are our body's main and preferred source of nutrients. And so when we take in carbs in different forms, our body actually digests it and stores it for later use. And when we store that energy in the form of carbs, that helps us fuel for CrossFit workouts, right? So when we come in here, if we don't eat carbs throughout the day, a lot of times we might feel sluggish, we might feel super unenergized, and a lot of that can be due to not eating enough of those carbs. In addition to that, it helps support recovery, right? And then fat is super important, and it's important to note too that for each of these macronutrients, we have, there's a certain amount of calories that come from each of them. So 1 gram of protein would give us 4 calories. 1 gram of carbs would give us 4 calories, but then fat's the outlier there with 1 gram giving us 9 calories in total, right? But fat is super important for helping us not only absorb certain vitamins and what are called micronutrients like vitamin A's, vitamin B's, all those different vitamins, but it also supports our hormonal function for all of us. So whether we're, you know, trying to think about having a child, or we're just trying to stay super like normal in our daily function, fat is super important to keep in our diets as well. And then up there in the right-hand corner, I like to think about alcohol as the 4th macronutrient because I know a lot of the people here for sure drink alcohol every so often, maybe some last night. But alcohol, for example, actually 1 gram of alcohol gives us 7 calories worth, right? So that's super important to mention. Alcohol is super touchy, right? Because it's not essential and there really is not any benefit from it. But again, not everyone is just comfortable with avoiding it. So it is important to note that, you know, drinking alcohol, there is a lot of feedback and issues that might come to recovery if we're consistently drinking it right after a workout, okay? What's the difference right after? So right after, we'll talk a little bit more into it when we talk about carbs. So right after a workout, you know, if I'm finishing a workout, my body's in this sort of fight mode, right? And we have higher cortisol levels. We'll talk about when we talk about carbs, but when we're trying to recover and basically bring ourselves down, our muscles are going to feed off of whatever next is coming into our body. That's why like a protein shake right after a workout like Connor's got over there, that's sort of everyone's go-to because that's what we've been told and that's what we've been taught. And protein is super important because that's the first thing that's going to help our muscles rebuild and repair after a hard workout. But also carbs are super important as well, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So protein. So for those of you who are not familiar, protein is actually made up of these amino acids, right? So there's 20 of these amino acids in our body, and some of them are naturally occurring and some of them are not. 9 of them are actually what are known as essential amino acids, which means that we are not able to produce them within our body, so we must get them in the form of food or supplementation. And so those are important because those amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and that is what's going to fuel and help recover our muscles specifically, right? So think about muscles and amino acids as this brick wall, right? If we keep hitting it with a sledgehammer, essentially like what we're doing here, sometimes literally, sometimes, you know, figuratively, in the gym here, we keep breaking down that muscle. It needs to be rebuilt. It needs to be, you know, cemented over, whatever, to sort of repair it. And those amino acids, especially those essential amino acids, are super important for that. Think about too, if we're trying to build muscle, right? We might eat more protein than we normally would. And that is just going to help us build an extra layer of protection or an extra layer of brick, essentially, on top of those amino acids that we're already consuming in our body, right? So protein is super important when it comes to making sure that we're recovering those muscles through getting enough of those amino acids. So these two sources here, these are lean protein and vegan protein sources. The one thing to note for vegan protein sources, right? Vegans, I was actually a vegan for 5.5, almost 6 years. And I was getting a lot of my protein from all these different sources. The problem that I found early on, but sort of learned as I spent more time in that plant-based lifestyle, was that when you're consuming vegan protein sources, you need to get a variety. And the reason for that is animal protein typically has, or almost always has, a complete protein source, which means it's getting all the essential amino acids whenever you're eating them. However, vegan protein sources, most of them do not have all of the essential amino acids. So if we're only eating tofu or tempeh or seitan throughout the day, we're often missing out on some of those essential amino acids as well, right? So if we want to make sure we're building up those muscles and repairing them as fast as we can, and we're in the plant-based sector, or we're thinking about being plant-based, we want to make sure we're getting a variety of those protein sources, okay? Then protein in terms of the thermic effect of food, right? So we talked about how whenever we just eat food and consume certain calories from certain foods, we are actually burning calories as well from just the act of digesting and absorbing them. Protein actually has the highest thermic effect of food than any other macronutrient, which basically means that if we're eating more protein, we're actually using more energy to digest and absorb that than any other of those macronutrients. So for example, if I was to eat 1,000 calories worth of protein, about 25% of that would go towards the digestion and the absorption of that protein into our body. So 250 calories would just be burnt off just trying to digest that, versus carbs or fats are typically around 5%, right? So it'd be 50 calories worth going towards that digestion and absorption of those calories. And then satiety, right? So protein, like I said, there's a whole market. My past life is actually working for a dairy and food and bev company where we would sell whey proteins and different protein sources to be put into protein bars and supplements and stuff like that. And there is so much hype around getting protein into more things because it keeps people fuller longer, right? You think back to the early, before I was born, right? The early 80s, there were only those Met RX bars in stores, right? And those were those meal replacement, super thick, super dense bars with like 600, 700 calories in them. And now we have Cliff bars, we've got One bars, we've got all these different bars to choose from, and they're all super high in protein. And the reason is because they keep you fuller for longer, and it's super easy to consume on the go, right? So protein, for example, is super good with keeping you fuller for longer. So it's important that we get enough of that, and that will help us avoid a little bit of that binge eating as well. And it's also just good to eat a little bit more protein for so many different reasons. Like I said, it's really good for recovering and repairing those current muscles and creating new muscles, like I said, with those essential amino acids in mind. And then lastly, one important thing to note is protein needs actually increase as we age, right? So as we age, our bodies just naturally become less efficient at digesting and absorbing that protein. So we really want to focus on, as we're getting older, into those older ages, consuming more protein than we normally would. Think about, if we're throwing one dart at a dartboard and trying to hit the bullseye, we might miss. But if we throw multiple, we'll more than likely hit the bullseye once. And then on top of that, a really important essential amino acid in those proteins when we're aging is leucine. Leucine actually helps us, as we age, digest and absorb those nutrients from protein a lot better. So if we're looking for a protein supplement, we'll talk about that a little bit more. One thing we can think about is looking for a supplement that has leucine in it if we're looking for aging protein powders, right? So that's super important to note as we age. And then in that top right corner, like I said, when I was vegan, people would always ask me, Connor, you're vegan, where do you get your protein? And I used to like get so pissed off at people because I was like tracking every single thing that I put in my body at that point. And I'm like, I really want to just lash back, especially my mom, and be like, well, how much protein are you eating a day, right? So it's important to note because everyone needs to know where they're getting their protein from. It's not just the vegans or the vegetarians, right? We all need to think about it on a daily basis. And I'd argue to say that a lot of us could get more protein than we are right now. Okay, yeah. Aaron.
What do you say is the best non-animal source of protein?
Non-animal source?
Yeah.
It depends. A lot of it comes down to your preference in terms of taste. So like when I was vegetarian, I would eat a lot of tofu just because it was a lot heartier, which filled me up more. And it was easier to include in dishes. But the trade-off there is a decent amount of fat in tofu as well. So I might eat seitan, which is super low in fat. And that might help me get a little bit more protein without getting as much fat in it. But they all have different micronutrients that sort of add benefit. There's not really any of them that would be bad for you per se, but again, you want to get a variety.
So which has the highest like grams of protein per serving?
Highest grams of protein? Typically it would be, I believe it's either edamame or seitan. So seitan in 4 ounces, there'd be 28 grams of protein.
Where does seitan not soy-based?
Seitan is made from wheat gluten. So it's actually a Korean form of protein, but it's basically wheat gluten that you boil and it sort of homogenizes together a little bit and makes this like almost chicken-like substance. A lot of tempeh is soy, so it's fermented soy. Yeah, it's fermented soy and it comes almost in like a brick. It's typically a lot harder.
So when you say get it from different sources, like tofu and tempeh, it's the same source.
More or less. So tofu would be 100% soy. Tempeh actually is fermented soy, but it has grains in it as well. So like often if you're buying them from the store, it'll say like tempeh with ancient grains or tempeh with like whole grains or stuff like that. So it's usually fermented with some sort of grain as well.
What is that like?
It says plant-based. Where do you get your protein from? Just to remind me to mention that everyone.
No, I was going to ask you because I can read the vegan proteins, but for whatever reason I can't see
the lean proteins.
You just read what they are. I can't read any.
Yeah. So for those lean proteins, and this is like macros per 4 ounces. So looking at there's a protein, fat, and carb content in each of them. We don't need to like dive into it. This is just more to give you some ideas. But for example, some of those lean protein sources are beef and bison, seitan, like we mentioned with the vegan, pork. Pork is going to be typically a little bit higher in fat. Lamb, edamame, Greek yogurt, chicken thigh, cottage cheese, tofu, turkey burgers or turkey, and then low-fat cheese. All right, so just to show there's a variety of sort of lean protein sources to choose from. That's got plant-based as well as meat sources as well.
And you want to have fish on there?
So fish should be included in that as well. Yeah, that's just not in the example actually.
So it's funny you mentioned pork because I used to always get this argument with my old roommate about lean pork versus fattier porks. Obviously, like he always said that when I was dieting, I would ingest pork occasionally instead of meat because it's lower in calories.
Yeah.
But I think it's lower in fat in these too, right?
It just depends.
Yeah, it depends on what cut it is.
Yeah. From the animal it is, and how much of the fat you can get like 99% fat-free beef now. So it's
true.
So it just depends on sort of what you're.
I guess
be careful when you got on the labels.
I guess what I'm trying to say though too is I often obviously, and that's the reason I want to do more protein sources because obviously you get really tired of chicken after a while.
Right.
And I would like throw some pork there, but I wouldn't eat beef. And like I said, I mentioned earlier made about that though too because you kept saying like pork is high in fat, which is fat equals water.
Right.
So
Like Lisa said, it just depends on what the source is. And today's day and age, you can find super lean sources of that pork as well. Because I get it. It is super boring to like eat chicken and rice. I kind of tend to like it sometimes because it's just easy, right? Yeah, no, for sure.
Versus like ribs from pigs.
Right. Yeah.
All right.
You have to just get good at reading labels and
Yeah.
right? Like, not grass fed is going to be in general. Just reading.
The problem is though too, is that when you get too lean, like there's not that same level of, like satisfaction. Like for example, like I can't do too much chicken breast. They get so fucking bored with chicken. I eat chicken thighs all day.
Right.
Because like that's just higher fat content. That just kind of fuels me a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a trade-off. Like, we'll talk about it, everything in moderation, but it's, you can have the lean chickens most of the time, but if we're mixing it up and we're having like a steak or something that's higher in fat, like a beef, that's totally fine, right? Like, if I was in someone else's shoes or if in my shoes starting out, like, if I can eat, chicken like 4 days of the week, and then I eat, maybe some beef or something higher in fat, 1 or 2 of those days, then for me, that's a win, right? We're just trying to sort of push that line a little bit further and further. And again, indulging, everyone's going to do it. Like no one's not going to indulge or have those sweets or those fats. You know what I mean? That's just part of life. So the big thing is not to be afraid of it, I guess is what I'm saying. Just think about it in moderation more than anything.
I've heard a bunch of mixed things on that men shouldn't eat soy.
So the science behind that is that when you eat more soy actually contains a lot of phytoestrogen. So you think estrogen, that's the typical hormone for females, right? And the idea is that if we eat a lot of that, then that's going to boost our estrogen levels as males. But it's actually a phytoestrogen, so it actually doesn't work like that neurologically and in your body. It doesn't connect to those same receptors, right? It's got that phytoestrogen, but it doesn't attach to those estrogen receptors to actually heighten your estrogen levels. But I can attest. I've been eating soy for a while.
I think even when people said you weren't supposed to, it was also you had to eat like 4 pounds of it every.
Right. Yeah, and like one thing to note too with these proteins is some of them are a lot quicker digesting. So typically animal proteins are going to digest a lot quicker. So like if you think about a whey protein that typically comes in what we get from protein shakes, we drink that after a workout. That's going to digest and absorb into our muscles a lot quicker than a plant-based protein, which that plant-based protein is super important and can be super beneficial, but it's going to stay in our body and digest over a longer period of time. So it's just important to note that as well. Like I said, when I was vegan, I was taking protein powders and they worked totally fine. But again, if we're like, it's the same thing with carbs we'll talk about, but if we're in the middle of like a competition or something, and we want to get some protein to those muscles immediately, a lot of the times, some of those protein powders, certainly like animal-based, will help us get that protein to our muscles a lot quicker. It's just quicker digesting in our body. Any other questions on protein? Next, we'll talk about carbs, right? So I think a lot of people, carbs get a bad rap, but I think a lot of people are afraid of them in today's day and age. And they're not an essential macronutrient, right? So if we did not eat carbs or near any carbs at all, we would be able to survive. It would just depend, if we're eating enough protein and fat and whether or not we'd be, surviving well. However, so like we see that a lot in today's day and age with the ketogenic diet, right? And not to sort of say the ketogenic diet doesn't work for people or isn't successful, but initially the whole idea of that keto diet was to put people in a fasted state to get to ketosis in order to help epileptic patients avoid more seizures. So the intent of that keto diet wasn't necessarily for the general population. It was for a very specific demographic of people who suffered from seizures and very consistent seizures. So basically what that keto diet is, for those of you who don't know, is we're eating very little to almost no carbs throughout the day with the goal of putting our body into ketosis and attracting ketones, which help us digest fat a little bit better in our body as a source of energy. So though that is sort of a route that some people can take, might work for some people, but it's important to note that our body's preferred source of energy is actually carbohydrates. So when we're doing a sport like CrossFit, carbs are actually pretty important and very important for not only our recovery, but our performance in the gym as well. So when we eat those carbs, what our body is doing in our liver is we are converting it from glucose to glycogen to sort of fuel our muscles and fuel our workout. So when we eat those carbs, they're actually stored in our liver and in our muscles for later use. But there's some trade-offs, right? And there's some purpose for that. So I like to give two different examples, right? So we've got Michael Scott, for those of you who are Office fans, who is doing a charity 5K run. And he's like, I'm going to carbo load so that my muscles, with the intent of having that carbs stored in our muscles and in our liver for energy use. You know, the source he chose is fettuccine Alfredo, maybe not the best choice, super high in fat. He also did it like 2 minutes before the race. But right, the idea there is to sort of overload those muscles and help them store carbohydrates so that when we're doing a sort of bigger athletic endeavor like a 5K or a half marathon or a marathon, that we can sort of tap into those extra energy sources for fuel for the later parts of our workout. So like the Tour de France, this is a guy from the Tour de France, a rider. This is a good example. So we have simple and complex carbs. Simple carbs are going to be those sugars, those cereals, those very high added sugar sort of products like the Coca-Cola. And the reason why someone like this Tour de France rider, who's supposed to be the pinnacle of health, is consuming this, right, is when they're in these legs of these races, they just need carbs to get to their muscles immediately, right? So he's chugging a Coca-Cola here. A lot of times we'll actually give riders like tablespoons or spoonfuls of syrup as well to help just get those simple carbs to their muscles. So simple carbs, while they are those sugars, and they typically are not great for us just because of what they do to our blood sugar levels in our body if we consume a lot of them, they do have a purpose in some certain situations. And then we have those complex carbs, which are going to be those carbs that are a little bit heartier and a little bit more dense. So they're going to give us energy over a longer period of time, and they're going to be digested by our muscles and in our body over a longer period of time. So think about the rices, the potatoes, the oatmeals, the apples. Well, actually, apples simple. Never mind. Ignore that. And the peas, the bananas, all those sort of sources of complex carbs. Those are going to digest in our body a lot slower, give us energy over a longer period of time. So before this race in the Tour de France, this biker was probably eating a lot more of those carbs, like those potatoes or rices or maybe some pasta as well, to help fuel up their body and keep that those carbs stored in their muscles and liver for later use. But then on top of that, carbs in general are just a great source of fiber, right? We'll talk about fiber's purpose a little bit more in a couple of slides, but carbs are a super good source of fiber. They're really good at supporting the endocrine system, which if you're not familiar with the endocrine system, I'd urge you to do some research on it. It's super cool. It's a sort of internal messenger system within our body that works with our brain, our gut, our muscles, and everything to signal different stuff to happen, whether it's insulin in our body and the release of it in order to help digest those carbohydrates and that glucose to turn it into the energy to be stored in our muscles, or if it's in the form of cortisol, which cortisol is that stress hormone where it's super high when we are eating large amounts of that blood sugar or large amounts of those carbs, and it's heightening our we're eating less of our carbs, the cortisol levels are typically higher, right? So cortisol is that stress hormone. When we are working out, we are super depleted of resources, right? Super depleted of carbs. And what happens is our cortisol levels are high and we're in that sort of fight mode, right? We're acting like we're back in the jungle trying to run from a tiger when we're in the gym. And so our cortisol levels are super high. And in order to help bring us down from those super high stress levels, it's super important to digest and take in some carbohydrates, because that's going to help signal our body to go from that fight mode to that flight mode. So the protein shakes after a workout are super great. That is one step I would take immediately to start to help us get to the first part of improving those macronutrients. But we also want to think about consuming some sort of carbs as well, about an hour or two after workouts as well. That'll help, again, get our body from that fight to flight mode and help us recover a lot better. Does anybody have any questions on carbs?
Yeah, like how do you
measure what the right amount, what's overdoing, what's undoing?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's different, right? So it can depend on our sort of daily activity. Like I said, a lot of the calories we burn is just from our daily life. So like if you're someone who's super sedentary, then we might think about eating a little bit less carbs. The general rule of thumb is we can use our hand for different measurements. So correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but it's our thumb is the amount of fat we should have in a meal. Our palm size is the amount of protein, and then our fist is the amount of carbs that we would have in a meal on a typical plate. So everyone's a little bit different, right? But that's sort of a good rule of thumb, no pun intended, to go off of. And you can kind of build your plate based on that. And then, like I said, everyone's lifestyles are different. So if, Jim, if you're finding that on Tuesdays, you're always on your feet and you're always walking for whatever reason, you might be burning more calories and utilizing more carbs. And so you might eat a little bit more carbs on a Monday to get you ready for that Tuesday, right? So it just depends on everyone, but that is sort of a good general starting point.
And by fat, like I would think like an avocado is a good fat. So in a meal, just like one slice of avocado in a meal.
Yeah, just about, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why I'm telling you.
Yeah, so like at the end method that Connor was explaining, there's been a lot of research done on, so first of all, we're all different sizes, as Connor was saying, and so our hands typically are different sizes according to our body size, right? So like my hand and Andy's hand, different sizes. Andy's hands, I can tell already, are a lot different, right? So like his cupped handful or his thumb or his palm, right? It's gonna account for his relatively bigger size, right, than mine. Also, like they've done some comparisons on people who like use their hand, right? Like the relationship between like the hand size and how that actually shakes out into your life. And like if you actually precisely measure it, right? So if you're using like a food scale or some other kind of measure, and they're very highly related, right? So that it's literally there's a great strategy if you're if measuring food for a variety of reasons isn't a sustainable or profitable practice.
Yeah. So yeah, like Lisa said, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more of this later. Like I've done a lot of different sort of approaches to diet and nutrition, and I've tracked my macros. I've done all this stuff, but I've kind of gotten to the point where it's like, it's super tedious and super almost annoying to track every single thing that you eat. And a lot of the times, a little bit over or under isn't going to, drastically change things. Obviously, we don't want to be crazy over. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're all human and we're all going to sort of have error. We're going to consume more. We're going to eat those sweets at a birthday party, whatever it is, right? So it's better to sort of have that as a general guideline than to just stick to like a certain number on the food scale every single day. Yeah.
So like in that example, you said on like if Tuesday you're going to be more active, like Monday eat more of those like complex carbs. Like I've also heard like 2 days before to like carb load. Is there like a good point? So,
yeah, just about. I mean, it's 24 to 48 hours is the general rule of thumb. I mean, it just depends on sort of the event because you can have more time to carbo load. So like if you're prepping for a marathon, you might start to eat more carbs 48 hours before and sort of gradually build up that carb load because you eat a lot versus if you're going to run like, you might be coming here on a Saturday where it's a 30-minute AMRAP. You might eat more carbs the night before just because that'll help keep you full and have that sort of energy source to tap into, right? It's not necessarily a marathon, but still, an athletic endeavor, right?
Yeah.
Ooh, any other questions on carbs?
I'll just add into that. We
Yeah.
talked about it last week. Come in early in the morning and like come in fasted. It's probably a good idea to probably at night. So like the majority I see of the carbs that I tend to eat during the day or get extra is at dinner time. After dinner, I might grab a little snack before bed of carbs specifically to kind of get me through the next morning because I'll be fasted until
Yeah. So that's a good example, Terry. So like I did my first workout this morning at 7 a.m. Didn't wake up at 5 to cook breakfast and let it digest. So last night I ate more rice than I normally would with dinner. And then when I woke up this morning on the way to the gym, I ate a smaller apple, right? Because that's more of those simple sugars that can digest a lot faster and get to our muscles. So it's just a little bit about how you strategize a little bit more as well.
Most of the time, I'd say they're complex carbs, just because they tend to be like potatoes and that's what Example for that for me usually is like fruit. So I'm usually craving something a little sweet, so I go for a little triangles of strawberries or raspberries, blueberries.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions actually now. So first, so I guess conversely then, for someone who's doing more workout for the end of the day, is it better to try to get more of those carbs in the morning then?
I guess.
Yeah.
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 But like, I guess that's tough though too. Sometimes, like for me personally, like it's easier for me to fast. So I'm never super hungry when I wake up. It's normally like maybe so that's good.
Yeah, or it just works differently with everybody and how you like to eat. Like you could add in like a kind of carby snack in the mid-morning instead of eating something really heavy at breakfast if you're not a breakfast person. Definitely have carbs at lunchtime. Like instead of maybe have a rice bowl with a lot of vegetables and some meat protein, so you get that rice in there like with carbohydrates, right? Maybe another small snack in the afternoon before you come out to your workout.
Yeah.
Another question that I had was you mentioned fruit, right? And that's of course that would be a complex carb. Now, I've heard this is actually something that like I've been thinking about for a while. Personally, I find that like I'm definitely more of a savory guy than a sweet guy. But like when I do have sweet cravings, I find it's very easy for me to substitute fruits as like a good substitute for seafood.
Yeah.
What would you say are like maybe like some good substitute for like salty snacks? So like generally. Like if I'm not dieting, obviously, like I just like like a big bag of chips or like what would be like some like maybe complex carbs that you like a good substitute for like
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different varieties. For those ones, it might be I don't know if Greg's bag is back there.
Yeah, the snacks, yeah.
Yeah, but there's just like different snacks. Like I said, there is like that's what Greg eats like all the time. They're called splits or spits or something like splits. And they're these like crackery type peas or green beans snacks or something like that. But they're super savory. Like they keep Greg like super full all the time, but they have a lot of protein and not a ton of carbs. And a lot of fiber, yeah. Or lentil.
From last week had like a whole list of stuff.
Yeah, it's all before you that.
Yes, for sure.
I mean, it's just, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's like again, we go back to this idea of like everything in moderation, right? I mean, if you're craving a salty snack and like you're super stressed because you're not able to eat the chips you love to eat or something like that, like again, it's about finding balance. It's not about knocking stuff out of your diet tomorrow, right? It's just about taking little steps to sort of get to that next point. And that might be, trying that snack that we just suggested. Maybe you love it, maybe you don't. But then maybe the next time we go to the grocery store, think about trying to see if there's any snacks that might fit into what you're looking for. That might not be as high in carbs, might have a little bit more protein or something like that. And you can just kind of experiment on your own too, right?
I think like when I'm doing that, I think I do want, like my body does want carbs, and they went to the salty carb snack. But I guess that's what I was saying. Maybe something that would be like a little more complex. I'm wondering, I don't know if they have like super or something like that. I don't know. Like, no,
they do. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's
I've done baked chips before, and like that comes sometimes with like
Yeah, or like like kale chips or something like that. Can't do those. I mean, and you can also make your own sweet potato chips at home, right? And like that might be something that's a little bit more, at least knowing it's coming from a whole source, and we're knowing how much oil we're putting on it, right? And you can at least have an idea of how that's being made as opposed to just buying something that's in a bag, right? So. All right, so we'll keep moving along here. If we have any more questions around carbs, we can talk about at the end. But next, we'll just touch on fiber here. So fiber, like Greg's snacks are super full in fiber. So fiber is super important. It helps and aid in our digestion and elimination of waste. So it comes in a couple different forms. You might have heard of insoluble fiber and then water soluble fiber. So that insoluble is just going to hold on and be a little bit more solid when we're digesting it, versus that water soluble is going to be a liquid in our body as we consume it, right? And those come from carbs. As you can see, there's a lot of different examples here of good sources of fiber, but they're basically these really cool little things that sort of help push things down our digestive tract and help keep us regular, help keep us moving things throughout and not just sort of sitting there and staying put in our guts. It's super good for cardioprotective, so very good for cardiovascular health, supporting our heart function as well when we eat enough fiber. And then there's been studies that shows it helps control blood sugar by slowing the absorption of that sugar. There's still a little bit of mystery around why it does that exactly, but that's something that fiber has been linked to when we eat enough of it in our diet. And so just a general rule of thumb of the minimums for men and women on daily consumption of fiber. So for women, we want to be getting more than 25 grams per day, and for men, more than 35 grams per day of fiber. So if we're eating those splits like Maura's going to eat right now, or if those of you, if there's anybody here who's plant-based or vegan, fiber and like sources like this for more protein are super important. We're going to be super high in fiber in our diets, right? So just by eating more plant-based sources to find more protein, that'll help get our fiber up as well too, okay? Anybody have any questions on fiber?
So is fiber basically in all veggies?
Pretty much in all most veggies, yeah. So that's a good point. So when we like make juices or smoothies, we lose that fiber. So it's important to eat those whole fruits and vegetables as opposed to, in a juice or smoothie form when we're looking for fiber. Because it's.
Well, just for the juice or just smoothies.
Well, the juices, whatever. Yeah, the juices. The juices, not the smoothies. Sorry. Yeah, the juices, you lose the fiber.
But if it's actual real raspberry. Yeah.
Popcorn?
I thought the show was starting.
That's a good question. Would you say complex? Yeah. I'd say complex, right? Because it's a grain. Yeah. Well, I mean, it depends. All right, everyone. So moving on to fats here. So when we look at fat, we've got 4 different sort of camps that are categories of fat. We might have seen them when we're looking at nutrition facts, all these different names, and there's 2 more on the next slide we'll talk about too. And we might not necessarily know what any of them mean. Those polyunsaturated fats. Helen, you want to give us a? Never mind. Well, we have polyunsaturated fats, which the reason it's poly is it has a double carbon and hydrogen bond in the actual molecule. Yeah, science. But that's the classification for polyunsaturated fats. And when we talk about polyunsaturated fats, those are going to be super high in omega-3s and omega-6s, okay? So those omega-3s are super important for anti-inflammatory in our joints, very good for heart health. And those omega-6s are very important for those as well. But those omega-6s, we're gonna find more of those in like those vegetable oils, and a traditional American diet usually has about a 1 to 15 or 15 to 1 ratio of those omega-3s to omega-6s. So we're super high in those omega-6s versus those omega-3s. However, the goal that we want is to be closer to a 4 to 1 ratio or 1 to 4 ratio of omega-3s to 6s, because there's a lot more intrinsic benefit from those omega-3s in our body, digesting and absorbing nutrients and also supporting hormone function. Okay, so keep that in mind when we're consuming those polyunsaturated fats. In addition to that, those polyunsaturated fats are super good at helping us lower our LDL, which is actually known as that bad cholesterol. So those polyunsaturated fats are super helpful for that. They're typically liquid at room temperature. And they can be found in sources like fish, nuts, and seeds. And like I said, with those omega-6s, vegetable oils as well. And then those monounsaturated fats, again, it's a single carbon hydrogen bond, right? So it's monounsaturated. That's where we're going to find the source for a lot of our omega-3s only. We're not going to get omega-6s from those monounsaturated fats. And then much like the polyunsaturated, those are going to have a lot of anti-inflammatory properties as well, although they're not going to be as much as those polyunsaturated fats would lend to. It's shown to improve insulin sensitivity and just helping us keep our blood sugar levels in check a little bit more. So those monounsaturated fats are super helpful for that. In addition, they also are good for lowering our LDL, that bad cholesterol, but they're also very helpful in maintaining a healthy HDL, which is that good cholesterol that we want to have good markers for if we ever get blood work done. And the source for those, for these can be olive oil, avocado, fish, nuts, and seeds, very similar to the polyunsaturated fats, like I said, but just a few different deviations there, okay? So when you're looking on, looking at a nutrition facts and you see polyunsaturated or monounsaturated, that those are more than not a good thing, okay? Obviously, we don't want astronomical number of fats, but poly and monounsaturated fats are good fats to consume when we're looking at nutrition facts. So then the other ones that we might weigh a little bit more, so the saturated fats, those are going to come from different sources like coconut oil or ghee for those of you who are plant-based, grass-fed butters, grass-fed beefs, cheese, eggs, dairy. So again, the saturated fats are one where we would say everything in moderation. It's not something that we necessarily need to kick out of our diet because there are a lot of benefits from it as well. But again, overdoing it can often lead us down a slippery slope. So there actually is a lot of benefit from eating that saturated fat for increasing that good HDL, that cholesterol. And the reason why we might use saturated fat is it's super helpful for cooking foods, right? If we're using butter to help cook, it can help us with high heat cooking. So there is a lot of benefit that can come from those saturated fats. And then there's a lot of studies that would lead high diets in saturated fats that show that that has a big impact on having heart disease. But there's in the same way, there's a lot of studies that would say higher diets in saturated fat leads to having less heart disease. So you can go either way on it. But like I said, everything in moderation, and just weigh the pros and cons of eating a lot of those cheeses, those dairies, and all that as well. But the ones that we can agree to stay away from and try and eliminate from our diet as best we can are those trans fats. Okay, those trans fats are also known as those partially hydrogenated oils. And they were created with the intent of keeping things on the shelves for longer and increasing those shelf lives of products so that they don't go bad and that we can consume them for longer, right? So those hydrogenated oils are not good for our body. They lower our HDL, which is that good cholesterol, and they also heighten our LDL, which is that bad cholesterol, right? So these are going to be coming from all that fast food, those pizzas, French fries, cookies, everything like that. So while I know we're not going to avoid those entirely, of course, I love to eat a pizza or a whole pizza or 2 pizzas in a sitting. It's important that we want to start to lower those, or, if we look at our nutrition facts, it's stuff we have in our daily diet, and we realize this has a lot of trans fat, maybe that's something super simple that we can sort of take out of our diet or start to think about taking out of our diet by replacing, okay? So like I said, you don't have to be the guy at the party who doesn't eat the cake, but just don't eat a cake every weekend, right?
That's margarine, right?
Margarine?
Partially hydrogenated oil.
Yeah, yeah. So taking all of that, next, what do I eat, or what do we eat, right? So the thing I like to tell people, and I've told this to my mom too, and she scoffs every time I tell her this, but I like to give everyone the adage of don't eat like an asshole 80% of the time, and you're good. Usually you're pretty good, right? That's a super simple, effective way to come across, but 80% of the time we should be eating real food as often as possible. And it should be minimally processed proteins, and we want to be able to get as much of those produce, those vegetables, as we can in each of our meals, right? I know Greg talked about last week about filling up those plates with more veggies and then putting some protein on it as well. Like I said, we want to make sure that that's a priority, those good minimally processed proteins, and then our produce on those plates as well, okay? And then on top of that, fruit is real food, so don't be afraid to eat fruit. There's obviously sugars in it, so we can always overdo things with the fruit, but again, fruit is super good, super important, helps us fuel our workouts in here as well, so don't be afraid of it. And then that other 20% of the time, you know, I would urge you to not go crazy, but just don't sweat it. If, like I said, we're at a birthday party and we have a piece of cake, or we're out with friends and we have a beer or two, right? That's natural stuff. I'm not trying to make anyone super stiff and, you know, afraid of having fun every so often and letting loose and eating, right? We all do that. Part of the reason we come in here too is so that we have a little bit more freedom, right? Because we're working so hard in here. We deserve a little bit of reward every so often, right? But the idea there being not more than 20%. Try and keep it less than 20% when it comes to that processed packaged food and those ingredients that you can't pronounce. One sort of cool thing to do is, like I said, if you have like a normal like diet that you consume throughout the day that has nutrition facts, go ahead and just look on the back of those labels and see what ingredients are in those products. And there might be some of those ingredients that we just can't pronounce. Like I know from my past experiences and work that there was so many different ingredients that would be in products that we made and produced that it was just overwhelming because you knew just what was going into those products, right? So I'd urge you to take a look at those favorite snacks you have and just see what those ingredients are. Like for example, when I buy peanut butter, I'll go to the store and I'll look for the natural peanut butters. And labels don't, or just saying natural on it doesn't always mean it's, you know, perfectly natural. So peanut butter, you can look on the back, and more often than not, if you look at the ingredients, it'll just say peanuts and peanut oil or something like that. But if we have peanuts and then canola oil or some other oil added to it, then we know it's not just natural peanut butter, right? So that's one easy thing to think about, is reading those labels and making sure you recognize the ingredients. So then how do we eat? How do we track it? Well, it's getting blurry now, but this is I can share this too, but this is sort of a good chart coming from Precision Nutrition, just around some of the different sources of protein, carbs, and fat, and how they sort of intertwine in those different macronutrients. It's just sort of a good rule of thumb to go off of. If we're coming up against the wall and we're not sure what proteins or fats or carbs to eat. And then if you want to, you can always track your calories, your macronutrients in MyFitnessPal, or I use FitGenie sometimes. Those are both good, super good resources. If you ever have any questions, us here at Feast, more than happy to help. But on top of that too, like supplementation, I would urge you first to find real food sources for those ingredients or those supplements we're trying to find before we start supplementing, right? So protein powder might be the initial one that we all think about. That's totally fine. It's a super easy way after a workout to get that protein in and get it to our muscles quickly. But again, I would urge you to not rely on that as your primary source of protein. Creatine's been shown to have a lot of benefits from neurological function to just helping us build muscle and maintain it throughout our life. So that might be something that we think about too. But again, creatine comes from a lot of different food sources as well. That includes a lot of red meats and meat in general. So again, we might already be getting enough of that creatine in our diets as well. Fish oil is super good for cardiovascular health, but also just our joints as well. But if we're getting enough of those those fats and in the right amounts, then those fish oils are not necessarily a supplement we need. And then you can go and find supplements for everything, right? I said there was 20 amino acids. You can find a supplement for every single amino acid. It doesn't mean that it's the right one or it's going to be 100% beneficial, but you can find supplements for just about anything. It doesn't mean that it's going to be the magic pill or the magic powder that, you know, takes you to the next level or makes you a CrossFit Games athlete, right? So think about real food sources before we start to supplement. And then sort of from there, how are we going to track all this? How are we going to see if we're consistent and if we're actually making progress when it comes to all that different stuff? So I would urge you to not rely on the scale. Scale weight is super inconsistent and it doesn't tell us the full picture, right? Oftentimes, if you wake up in the morning, first thing you do is step on the scale. You might be depleted, like Jerry said, of a lot of water. If you hadn't drank the night before, if you had a bunch of alcohol the night before, whatever it may be. So using a scale doesn't really give us the whole picture. And it certainly doesn't give us the whole picture if we're measuring at different times throughout the day or throughout the week. And even if we're weighing from day to day, one day isn't going to be telling us the true picture of what's going on in our bodies, okay? So I'd urge you to not necessarily go with the scale, but one amazing tool we have here at Feast in that PT room behind the screens in the front is we have an in-body machine, right? So if you have nutrition, or we have nutrition coaches here, we can walk you through how to use those. But using that in-body machine, we can start to focus on building more muscle mass on our body, right? Because building more muscle often takes care of those body composition issues in its own. Having more of that muscle helps us burn calories and is just in and of itself super productive and efficient way to have our bodies. So in-body machine we can utilize to our advantage, and we can actually make accounts on the machine so we can see our progress every time we measure. But when we do that, you should do it under consistent and the same conditions each time. So ideally first thing in the morning, post-poop, but also pre-feed. So think about that when you are looking into the in-body machine. If you have any questions, obviously, we're more than happy to help you here at Feast. And then again, measuring progress, it's not linear. Progress, when it comes to weight and body composition, is a lot of different factors, right? If you're sleeping well, if your just energy level overall is well, that in itself might be more beneficial to us in the long run than just losing weight for weight's sake. Those diets that are saying you'll lose your weight in 30 days or lose 50 pounds in 30 days, one, are oftentimes not sustainable, and two, we might be losing weight that is actually beneficial to our bodies and our function. So super important that we find an approach that's sustainable and that we can measure progress in so many other factors besides just the weight. And when we do see benefits in a lot of different areas, I know that we will start to see body composition gains too as well, right? We just need to be patient and stay consistent, which brings me to the last point. This is me throughout the years because I don't really have a before and after, but when I was younger, I was a chubbier kid, right? Even through puberty, that picture there is right before I started working out when I was about 16 or 17 years old. I had very little muscle mass, but I was also a very active kid. I played a lot of sports, but I didn't know anything about nutrition, right? No one in my family, and to this day, is super invested in nutrition or knows much about it. Like when I was growing up, my grandfather, he used to make bagels with what I thought was cream cheese on it. It was actually mayonnaise. Yeah, which is gross. But my family is just a typical, like, Irish Catholic family. You had a lot of hearty meats, potatoes, a lot of fat. And so I didn't really have much knowledge around nutrition. But the more I started nerding out, learned more about it myself, and just experimented, I started to find what worked for me, right? And like I said, I've done everything from track macros to supplement with different amino acids. And really what's worked for me is just being consistent and being super patient, right? We come in the gym and we work hard. We're not going to expect to come in here one day and hit 135-pound clean and jerk, and then the next day hit a 225-pound clean and jerk, right? There's steps that we have to take in order to get to that point. And it takes a lot of patience and a lot of consistency to get to that point, okay? So I would urge you all to start taking little steps, whether that's, thinking about adding more carbs in around your workouts, or thinking about adding or taking out those trans fats, or finding different substitutes for some of those fattier snacks, right? Little steps here and there will be huge in the long run. And it's the long game, right? We plan on being around for a while, so there's no point in trying to figure it all out tomorrow. And that's it, everyone.
That if you're looking at everything that was said today and you're like, holy grab? Where do I even start? Please grab your nutrition coach or grab one of the nutrition coaches here at Feast. Will help you figure out what's that first step to take, right? What's that one thing that you can tackle that's not going to feel completely overwhelming because you might